People like you should know your place." The words hit harder than the glass that shattered a second later, echoing across the dining room like something breaking that couldn't be fixed. And I remember thinking, not about the mess, not about the manager glaring from across the floor, but about how quiet the old woman beside me suddenly became, like the world had just confirmed something she already knew. I was still holding the tray when it happened, my fingers trembling just enough to make the silverware clink, not loud, but loud. Enough for them to notice, for them to smile, for them to lean back in their expensive chairs like this was entertainment they had paid for. And maybe they had, because everything in this place had a price, even dignity. I work at a restaurant where a single steak costs more than my weekly groceries, where people measure worth in reservations and watches and last names. And tonight, like most nights, I kept my head down, moved fast, smiled when I needed to, stayed invisible when I could, but invisibility doesn't last long when someone decides to see you for the wrong reasons. It started 10 minutes earlier when she walked in, the old woman, small frame, silver hair pulled back neatly, wearing a coat that had seen better winters, not homeless, not lost, just overlooked, the kind of person most hosts pretend not to notice when the wait list is full. And I saw the hesitation, the way the hostess glanced at her, then at the reservation book, then back at her again with that polite smile that means no. And I don't know why I stepped in. Maybe because she reminded me of my mom, or maybe because kindness feels like a reflex you forget you have until it's tested. But I walked over, offered her my section, told her I'd take care of it, even if it meant hearing about it later. She thanked me with a softness that didn't match the sharp edges of this place, and I sat her down at a small table near the window, poured her water, asked if she was warm enough. Simple things, normal things, the kind of things that shouldn't matter but somehow always do. And for a moment, it felt quiet again, like the chaos stayed on the other side of the room. Then they noticed, 4 of them, dressed like money, voices just loud enough to carry. One of them laughing as he leaned back and said something about charity cases, another asking if we'd started offering discounts for strays. And I felt it, that shift in the air, the way conversations nearby slowed just enough to listen, just enough to not intervene, because nobody wants to be the one who interrupts people like them. I kept my eyes on her, on Margaret. She told me her name when I asked, pretended I didn't hear, because sometimes ignoring it is easier than confronting it. But they didn't like being ignored. People like that rarely do. And one of them called out to me directly, snapping his fingers like I was part of the furniture, asking if I planned to serve her kind, with the same plates as everyone else. And that's when my hands stopped moving. Just for a second, just long enough for the silence to stretch, for the room to lean in, for me to realize that whatever I said next would matter more than the tip I was about to lose. I looked at him, really looked, and then back at Margaret, who hadn't touched her water, who sat there calm, almost too calm, like she'd been here before in ways I didn't understand. And I heard myself say it before I could stop it, quiet but steady. Everyone gets the same service here. And the words felt heavier than they should have, like I had just stepped onto something that might not hold my weight. The man smiled, slow, amused, like I had just made his night more interesting. And somewhere behind me, I could feel the manager starting to move, the tension building, the kind that doesn't explode but lingers, waiting. And Margaret reached out then, her hand resting lightly over mine, warm, steady, grounding. And she looked up at me with eyes that didn't match the rest of her at all, eyes that held something deeper, something unreadable. And she said, almost to herself, kindness always costs more than people expect. And I didn't know why, but that was the moment I realized this night wasn't going to end the way it started. The manager's heels clicked against the marble floor before I even turned around, sharp and deliberate, the kind of sound that meant trouble was already decided before you had a chance to explain. And I felt my stomach tighten as her hand landed lightly on my arm. Not rough, not angry, just controlled, which somehow made it worse, because control meant calculation, and calculation meant I was already on the losing side. Emily, she said under her breath, her smile still perfectly in place for the rest of the room. A word, and I knew better than to argue, knew better than to make a scene, but Margaret's hand was still resting over mine, steady as ever. And for a second I hesitated, just long enough for the man at the table to let out a quiet laugh, like he had already won something I had not agreed to give him. I gently pulled my hand free and followed the manager a few steps away, close enough that I could still see Margaret sitting there alone, her posture unchanged, her gaze calm, like none of this surprised her, like she was waiting for something I could not see yet. "What do you think you are doing?" the manager whispered, her voice tight but measured. "Those guests are some of our most important clients, and you are standing there arguing with them over." She glanced toward Margaret, her expression shifting just slightly. "Over that." And there it was, not loud, not public, but clear enough, the same line drawn in a quieter tone, the same assumption dressed up as professionalism. I swallowed, keeping my voice low. "I am just doing my job." And even as I said it, I knew it was not the full truth, because my job did not require me to push back. My job did not require me to risk anything. But something about tonight made it impossible to step back into that safe space of silence. The manager sighed, a small, practiced sound. "Your job is to keep the guests happy, all of them, especially the ones who can shut this place down with one phone call." She leaned in slightly, her tone sharpening. "Go back, apologize, smooth it over, and do not make this harder than it needs to be." And I felt the weight of that choice settle in. Simple on the surface, just a few words, just a small compromise, the kind people make every day without thinking twice. But when I looked past her shoulder and saw Margaret still sitting there, untouched glass of water catching the light, eyes watching me with something that felt almost like quiet expectation, the words refused to come. I walked back slowly, each step louder in my head than it should have been. The table coming back into focus, the four men waiting, their expressions ranging from amused to impatient, and the one who had spoken before leaned forward slightly, tapping his fingers against the table like he was timing me, like this was a performance he expected to end a certain way. I stopped beside Margaret's table, my hands steady now in a way they had not been before, and I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Is there something else I can get you?" I asked, keeping my tone even, professional, and for a second, just a second, his smile faltered, like that was not the answer he had been expecting. "Yes," he said finally, leaning back again, his voice louder now, meant to carry. "You can start by apologizing, to all of us, for the way you handled this." And the room shifted again, that subtle pull of attention. People pretending not to listen while listening to every word. And I could feel the manager watching from behind, waiting for me to fix it, waiting for me to choose the easy way out. I glanced at Margaret, just briefly, and she gave the smallest shake of her head, almost imperceptible, but enough, and something in my chest settled into place, something quiet but unmovable. I turned back to the table, my voice steady. "I am sorry if there was any confusion, but I did not do anything wrong." And the silence that followed was heavier than anything they had said before, because this time it was not just about embarrassment or inconvenience. It was about defiance, small but undeniable, and the man's expression hardened, his amusement thinning into something colder. "You might want to rethink that," he said, softer now, more dangerous in its calm, "because people in your position do not get to decide what is right." And before I could respond, Margaret's voice cut through the tension, gentle but clear. "Actually," she said, lifting her gaze toward them for the first time, "sometimes they do." And the way she said it, the quiet certainty in her tone, made the air feel different, like something had just shifted beneath all of us, something none of them had noticed yet. The shift in the room was subtle, almost invisible, but I felt it the way you feel a storm before it breaks, a pressure in the air that made it harder to breathe. And for the first time since this started, the men at the table were not entirely in control of it. The one who had been leading the conversation leaned forward again, slower this time, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Margaret like he was seeing her clearly for the first time, like something about her calm did not fit the role he had already assigned her. And that uncertainty, even if it was small, was enough to change the rhythm of everything. "You should be careful," he said, his voice quieter now, measured in a different way. "This does not concern you." And the way he said it sounded less like dismissal and more like a warning. But Margaret did not flinch, did not look away. She simply folded her hands in her lap, her posture straightening just enough to make her seem taller than she was. And when she spoke again, her voice carried without needing to rise. "Kindness always concerns me," she said, And there was something in the way the words settled over the table that made even the background noise of the restaurant hesitate, like the space itself was listening. I stood there, caught between them, aware of the manager hovering just out of sight, aware of every pair of eyes pretending not to watch. And I realized this was no longer about a spilled glass or a complaint. It had become something else. Entirely, something I did not fully understand but could not step away from either. The man exhaled slowly, leaning back as if recalculating, and one of the others at the table shifted in his seat, glancing toward the entrance for a brief second before looking back. A small movement that might have meant nothing if not for the way his expression tightened just slightly afterward, like he had expected something or someone to already be there. I followed that glance without thinking, my eyes drifting toward the front of the restaurant, where the glass doors reflected the city lights outside, rain beginning to streak down the surface in thin lines that caught the glow from inside. And for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the next second was waiting for permission to happen. Behind me, I heard the manager step closer, her voice low but urgent. "Emily, enough," she said, her hand reaching for my arm again. But I did not move. Not because I was trying to be difficult, but because something in Margaret's stillness held me in place. Like leaving now would mean missing the part of the story that explained everything. The man at the table let out a short, humorless laugh. "This is ridiculous," he said, louder now, the edge returning to his tone as he tried to reclaim the moment. "We are wasting time over nothing." And he gestured vaguely toward Margaret, as if reducing her to a detail would make this easier again. Simpler, safer for him. But before anyone could respond, before the manager could pull me away or the tension could snap back into its old shape, the front doors opened, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for a draft of cool air to slip inside, carrying the faint scent of rain and something else, something sharper, more deliberate. And I saw it immediately. The reaction, the way the host at the stand straightened instinctively, the way one of the bartenders paused mid-pour, the way even the man at the table stopped speaking mid-sentence. Without realizing it, I did not know who had walked in yet, not fully, but I knew it mattered, because the room knew before I did, the kind of knowing that does not come from announcements or introductions, but from presence alone. Margaret's hand found mine again, just lightly, her grip steady, and she did not look toward the door, not even once, as if she did not need to, as if she had been expecting this all along. And when she spoke, it was barely above a whisper, meant only for me. "Some people," she said softly, "do not need to raise their voice to be heard." And as the sound of measured footsteps crossed the floor behind me, slow, controlled, impossible to ignore, I felt the entire room shift around us, not with noise, not with chaos, but with something far more powerful, something quiet that demanded attention without asking for it. The footsteps did not rush, did not hesitate. They moved with a rhythm that felt deliberate. Each step measured like the person behind them had nowhere to be except exactly where he was going. And I felt it before I saw him. That shift Margaret had warned me about. That quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. Conversations did not stop all at once. They unraveled, one voice fading, then another, until the entire room settled into a silence that was not forced but chosen, the kind people fall into when they realize something important is happening and they do not want to miss it. I turned slowly, my breath catching somewhere between curiosity and something I could not quite name, and that was when I saw him, tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that fit like it had been made for him alone, his presence cutting through the space without effort, without noise, and yet every eye found him anyway. He did not look around the room like someone searching, he looked through it, as if everything and everyone was already accounted for, as if the only thing that mattered was directly ahead. And when his gaze passed over the tables, the staff, the guests, people straightened instinctively, shoulders pulling back, voices lowering, not out of fear exactly, but out of recognition, the kind that comes from understanding hierarchy without needing it explained. I felt the manager step back behind me, not dramatically, just enough to remove herself from the center of whatever this was becoming, and the men at the table shifted too, their earlier confidence thinning into something less certain, less controlled, and it was subtle, almost invisible, but I saw it. The way one of them adjusted his jacket, The way another glanced down at his phone, as if suddenly unsure of where to look. The man kept walking, his pace unchanged, his expression unreadable, and for a second I wondered if he would pass us entirely. If this moment would dissolve into something else, something easier to understand. But then he stopped, not beside them, not near the manager, but directly at Margaret's table, and everything in the room seemed to hold its breath at once. He did not speak right away, did not acknowledge anyone else, his attention settling on Margaret with a stillness that felt heavier than any words could have been. And for the first time since I had met her, she looked up at someone with something more than quiet observation, something softer, something almost familiar. And when she spoke, her voice carried a warmth I had not heard before. "You are late," she said, not accusing, not upset, just stating it like a fact that had already been forgiven. The man exhaled slightly, the smallest shift in his posture breaking the perfect control he had held since entering. And there was something in that moment, something human beneath the precision. "I came as soon as I could," he replied, his voice low, steady, but not cold, not with her. And that was when it clicked, not all at once, not in some dramatic realization, but in pieces, in the way the room reacted, in the way the men at the table had gone completely still, in the way Margaret's hand tightened slightly around mine before letting go. He turned then, just enough to look at me, his eyes sharp, assessing, but not unkind, as if he was placing me into a story he already understood, and I felt my heartbeat pick up under that gaze, not from fear, but from the weight of being seen in a way I had not expected. "You helped her," he said, not a question, and I nodded before I could stop myself, my voice quieter than I intended. "Yes." And for a second, just a second, something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like approval, or maybe acknowledgement, something rare and unspoken. Behind him, the man from the table cleared his throat, the sound too loud in the silence, trying to pull the moment back into something he could control. "Sir, there has been a misunderstanding," he began, his tone carefully respectful now, stripped of the earlier arrogance, and the contrast was so stark it almost felt unreal. The man did not look at him immediately, did not rush to respond. He simply let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle, and when he finally turned, his gaze was different, colder, not raised in anger, not sharpened by volume, but precise in a way that made it impossible to ignore. "There was no misunderstanding," he said, calm, controlled, final, and the room seemed to absorb the words like a verdict that had already been decided long before any of us arrived. The silence that followed his words did not feel empty. It felt full, heavy in a way that pressed against my chest and made it harder to breathe. Like something invisible had just shifted the balance of the entire room, and everyone could feel it whether they understood it or not. The man at the table who had spoken before straightened in his chair, his earlier confidence gone, replaced with something careful, something calculated. "Of course," he said quickly, forcing a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. We did not realize there was a connection, and the pause before the last word said more than the word itself, like he was trying to adjust to a reality he had not prepared for. The man standing beside me did not respond right away. He simply looked at him, not with anger, not with impatience, just with a level of attention that felt precise, like he was measuring something that had already been decided. And then, almost as an afterthought, he spoke. "You did not ask," his tone even, almost conversational, but the effect was immediate, the table going still again, the weight of those 3 words settling deeper than anything louder could have. I could feel my own pulse in my ears, my awareness sharpening, every detail suddenly clearer, the faint hum of the lights above, the soft clink of glass somewhere far behind me, the way Margaret sat completely at ease beside me, as if none of this surprised her, as if she had seen this exact moment unfold 100 times before. One of the other men at the table leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, respectful in a way that felt almost rehearsed. "If there has been any offense, we are prepared to make it right." And I realized then that everything had changed, not just their tone, not just their posture, but the entire structure of the conversation, because now they were not in control of it anymore. They were responding to it, adjusting to it, trying to recover ground they had already lost. The man beside me glanced at Margaret briefly, And there was something in that look, something softer, something that did not belong to the version of him the rest of the room was seeing. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet finality. "My mother does not need anything from you." And the words settled into place with a clarity that made my breath catch for just a second, because even though I had already felt it, already sensed it in pieces, hearing it said out loud made it real in a way nothing else had. I looked at Margaret, really looked this time, at the way she held herself, at the calm that had never wavered, at the quiet confidence that had never once felt out of place, and suddenly everything about her made sense in a way it had not before, not because she had changed, but because I finally understood what I had been seeing all along. The men at the table exchanged quick glances, their expressions tightening, recalculating, and the one who had spoken first nodded slowly. "Understood," he said, his voice steady again but stripped of everything it had carried earlier. "We apologize for any misunderstanding." And the words sounded practiced, careful, chosen for their safety rather than their sincerity. The man beside me did not acknowledge the apology directly, did not accept it or reject it. He simply turned his attention back to Margaret, as if the rest of the room had already faded into something irrelevant. And in that moment, I realized something I had never seen before. That power did not always need to respond, did not always need to prove itself. Sometimes it simply existed, and everything else adjusted around it. Margaret reached for her glass then, finally taking a small sip of water, her movements unhurried, her expression unchanged. And when she set it back down, she looked at me with a quiet warmth that felt grounding in a way I could not explain. "You handled yourself well," she said softly, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because in a room where everything had just shifted so dramatically, her words brought it back to something human, something simple. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the man beside me spoke again, his gaze returning to me, sharper now, more focused. "You did not apologize," he said, not accusing, not critical, just stating it like a fact he found interesting, and I felt my heartbeat pick up again under that attention, my voice quieter than I expected, because I did not do anything wrong. And for a brief moment, the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel like something had been acknowledged, something rare, something that did not happen often in his world. For a moment, nothing moved, not the guests, not the staff, not even the tension that had filled the room. It just hovered there, suspended, like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, and I realized this was the part people never talked about, the quiet after something shifts, when no one is sure which direction things will fall. The men at the table did not speak again, not immediately. Their earlier confidence replaced with a careful stillness, like they were choosing each breath instead of taking it naturally. And one of them reached for his glass, his hand steady but slower than before, as if even small movements needed permission now. The manager, who had been hovering just behind me, took another step back, her posture subtly changing from authority to distance, as though she was quietly removing herself from whatever this situation had become. And I could almost feel the line being redrawn in real time, not by words, but by presence alone. The man beside me, Adrian, did not look at them again, not even a glance, as if they had already been categorized and set aside, his attention returning fully to Margaret. And there was something in that shift that felt final, like a door closing without a sound. "Have you eaten?" he asked her, his voice softer now, the edge gone, replaced with something that felt almost ordinary, almost human. And the contrast was so stark it made the moment feel unreal, like I was watching two different versions of the same person exist at once. Margaret smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried history behind it. "I was waiting," she said simply, and I felt something in my chest tighten again, not from fear this time, but from witnessing something personal unfold in a place that had been anything but personal just minutes ago. Adrian nodded once, then turned his gaze toward me again, and I felt it immediately, that sharp awareness of being seen, not dismissed, not overlooked, but fully acknowledged. "Sit with us," he said, not as a command, not exactly, but not a suggestion either, something in between that did not leave much room for refusal. And I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my mind catching up to what he had just said, because waitresses do not sit with guests, not here, not ever. and certainly not at a table like this. I glanced toward the manager instinctively, expecting interruption, correction, something to pull me back into the role I understood, but she did not move, did not speak, her expression carefully neutral, as if she had decided that. This was no longer her decision to make. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, creating space beside her, her gaze warm, encouraging in a quiet way that made the choice feel less impossible, and before I could overthink it, I found myself sitting down, the fabric of the chair unfamiliar beneath me from this side of the table, my hands resting lightly in my lap as I tried to steady the sudden awareness of how much everything had changed. The men at the other table stood shortly after, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a quiet retreat. Murmured words exchanged between them, their presence dissolving from the room in a way that felt almost deliberate, like they understood this was no longer a place they belonged, and no one stopped them, no one acknowledged their exit. It was as if they had already been erased from the moment before they reached the door. I watched them leave from the corner of my eye, a strange sense of distance settling in, like what had just happened belonged to a different version of the evening, one that no longer applied. "What is your name?" Adrian asked, drawing my attention back, his tone steady, focused, and I realized this was the first real question he had asked me. The first moment that felt like it was about me rather than the situation. "Emily," I said, my voice quieter than I intended but clear enough, and he nodded once, like he was committing it to memory, like it mattered more than I understood. Margaret reached for my hand again, her touch light but grounding. "Emily chose kindness," she said softly, her eyes lifting to Adrian with a meaning I could not fully grasp, and something in his expression shifted again, not dramatically, just enough to feel it, like a decision was forming beneath the surface. He looked back at me then, his gaze steady, unreadable but not cold. "That is rare," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it feel less like a compliment and more like a recognition of something that came with a cost, something that did not go unnoticed in his world. And as the room slowly began to breathe again around us, I realized this night had moved far beyond anything I had expected when my shift started, into something I was no longer just witnessing, but part of. It felt wrong to be sitting there, not in a dramatic way, not like I had crossed some visible line, but in a quieter, deeper sense, like I had stepped into a space that was not built for someone like me, and yet no one was asking me to leave. The table looked different from this side, the polished surface reflecting the soft light above, the neatly folded napkins, the untouched glass that still held the faint outline of Margaret's fingers, and I became aware of every small detail, as if noticing them could somehow anchor me in a moment that felt too unfamiliar to trust. Adrian did not rush the silence, did not fill it with unnecessary words. He simply sat across from us, his posture relaxed but deliberate, like even stillness was something he controlled, and for the first time since he had entered, I noticed the way his presence did not demand attention anymore. It held it, effortlessly, without effort or display. Margaret reached for the menu, glancing at it briefly before setting it aside. "You already know what I like," she said, her tone carrying a quiet certainty that felt almost routine, and Adrian nodded once. A small acknowledgement that seemed to carry years of unspoken understanding. He gestured lightly, and within seconds a server appeared, not rushing, not hesitant, just precisely on time, as if the timing itself had been anticipated, and Adrian placed the order in a low voice, simple, direct, without embellishment, and the server nodded, leaving just as smoothly as they had arrived. I realized then that everything around him operated on a different rhythm, not faster, not slower, just aligned, in a way I had never seen before. "You work here full-time?" he asked, his attention returning to me, and the question felt straightforward, but the way he asked it made it feel like more than small talk, like he was placing pieces together, building a picture I could not yet see. "Yes," I answered, my voice steady now, finding a kind of balance in the quiet of the table. "I have been here for almost 2 years." And he nodded again, his gaze thoughtful, not intrusive, but focused in a way that made it clear he was listening, actually listening, which felt unexpected in a place where most people only heard what they needed to respond. "And you stayed," he said after a moment, not questioning, just observing, and I understood what he meant without him needing to explain, because staying in a place like this, dealing with people like that, required a kind of endurance that rarely got noticed. I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. It pays the bills, I said, a simple truth that felt oddly heavier in this setting, and Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around mine, not in sympathy, but in understanding. Adrian's expression shifted again, something quieter settling in, like he had expected that answer, but still found something in it worth noting. There are easier ways, he said, not dismissing, not judging, just stating it like a possibility, and I met his gaze, holding it for a second longer than I might have earlier in the night. Not for everyone, I replied, and the words came out steadier than I felt, carrying more than just practicality, carrying the weight of choices that were not always choices at all. For a brief moment, the air between us changed. Again, not tense, not heavy, but charged in a different way, like something had been acknowledged without needing to be explained. Across the room, the usual rhythm of the restaurant had begun to return, conversations picking back up, glasses clinking, the illusion of normalcy reassembling itself piece by piece. But it felt distant now, like it belonged to a version of the evening I had already stepped out of. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze still on me, and there was something in it that felt less like evaluation now and more like consideration, like he was weighing something that had not been part of his plans when he walked in. Margaret watched us both quietly, a faint smile touching her lips, not amused, not surprised, just knowing, as if she had seen this exact exchange before in a different form, at a different time. Kindness, Adrian said after a moment, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful, is not something people in your position are expected to offer without reason. And I felt the words settle somewhere deeper than they should have, because they were not entirely wrong, and yet they did not feel like the full truth either. I glanced down briefly, then back up, meeting his gaze again. Maybe that is why it matters when someone does, I said, and the silence that followed was different from before, not uncertain, not tense, but full in a quieter way, like something had just been placed on the table that neither of us was ready to move yet. The food arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, plates placed with a precision that matched everything else about this table. And for a moment I just watched, the way steam rose gently from the dish in front of Margaret, the way Adrian gave the smallest nod of approval before the server stepped away. Like even something as simple as a meal followed an unspoken order I was only beginning to recognize. Margaret picked up her fork with calm familiarity, as if nothing about this setting intimidated her, as if she had always belonged exactly where she was sitting, and maybe she had. Maybe this world had always been hers in a way I had only just started to understand. I hesitated before touching anything, my awareness still catching up to the reality that I was no longer standing, no longer serving, but sitting, included in a space that had been entirely closed to me less than 30 minutes ago. And that shift still felt unreal, like it could disappear if I moved too quickly. Eat, Margaret said gently, her tone carrying a quiet reassurance that made it easier to breathe, and I nodded, picking up my fork, the simple act grounding me in a way I did not expect. Adrian watched for a moment, not intrusive, not intense, just observant, like he was noting the way I adjusted, the way I held myself, the small details that most people would overlook. And then he spoke again, his voice low enough to stay within the space of the table. You did not hesitate, he said, and I knew he was not talking about the food. I glanced at him, meeting his gaze. I did. I admitted quietly, because that was the truth. I just did not let it stop me. And something in his expression shifted. Again, not surprise, not exactly, but recognition, like he understood that distinction in a way others might not. Across from us, Margaret smiled faintly, her attention moving between us with a calm that felt almost intentional, as if she was watching something unfold that she had already anticipated. Most people hesitate and then choose comfort, she said softly, her words carrying more weight than their volume suggested. You hesitated and chose something else, and I felt the meaning settle in, not as praise, but as acknowledgement of a choice that had consequences I had not fully considered yet. The restaurant around us had returned to its usual rhythm now. Conversations flowing, laughter rising and falling, the earlier tension dissolving into something that could almost be forgotten if you had not been at the center of it. But for me, Everything still felt sharper, more defined. Like I was seeing the same space through a different lens. I noticed the way staff moved differently. Around Adrian. More precise, more aware, not fearful, but attentive in a way that spoke of experience, of understanding without instruction, and I realized this was not just influence, it was something deeper. Something established long before tonight. "What are you studying?" Adrian asked suddenly, and the question caught me off guard just enough to pause, because it reached beyond the immediate, beyond the restaurant, into something more personal, something that belonged to a version of me that did not exist in this uniform. "Nursing," I said after a second, my voice steady. "I take classes during the day," and his gaze sharpened slightly, not in judgment, but in interest, like the answer had added another layer to whatever picture he was forming. "That explains it," he said, almost to himself, and I frowned slightly. "Explains what?" I asked, and he held my gaze for a moment before answering. "Why you chose to stay." And the words settled differently this time, carrying more context, more understanding than before. I leaned back slightly, considering that, because he was not wrong, not entirely, but it was more than that. It was not just about training or obligation. It was something harder to define, something that did not fit neatly into a reason. "Maybe," I said quietly, "or maybe it is just who I am." And the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, not uncertain. It was something else, something steady, like a foundation being laid without needing to be named. Adrian's gaze did not leave mine immediately, and there was something in it now that had not been there before. Not just observation, not just calculation, but a kind of quiet decision, something forming beneath the surface that I could not yet see but could feel all the same, like the beginning of something that would not end with this night. The moment did not end with a dramatic shift or a sudden realization. It unfolded quietly, the way everything else had tonight, in small changes that felt heavier than anything loud could have been, and I sat there, aware that something had already changed in a way that could not be undone. The plates in front of us were nearly empty now, the soft hum of the restaurant fully restored around us, but it felt distant, like background noise to something more important happening at this table. Something that did not need an audience to matter. Margaret set her fork down with gentle precision, dabbing the corner of her lips with a napkin before folding it neatly beside her plate, her movements unhurried, composed, as if she had all the time in the world. And when she looked at me again, there was a quiet certainty in her eyes that made me sit a little straighter without realizing it. "You will not stay here forever," she said softly, not as a question, not even as advice, but as something closer to a fact, and the words caught me off guard, because they reached beyond the moment, beyond the restaurant, into something I had not allowed myself to think about too clearly. I let out a small breath, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table, grounding myself. "I do not plan to," I answered honestly, and for a second, the weight of that truth settled between us, not heavy, but real. Adrian watched the exchange without interrupting, his gaze moving from Margaret to me with a focus that felt sharper now, more intentional, like whatever he had been considering earlier had taken shape into something clearer. "Plans change," he said after a moment, his tone calm, measured, but carrying something beneath it, something that suggested experience rather than speculation, and I met his gaze again, holding it just long enough to feel that same quiet pressure build, not uncomfortable, but undeniable. "Only if you let them," I replied, and the words came out steadier than I expected, carrying more certainty than I usually allowed myself. And for a brief moment, something in his expression shifted again, that almost imperceptible acknowledgement I had started to recognize, like he respected the answer even if he did not fully agree with it. Margaret's soft laughter broke the tension, warm and genuine, the first real sound of ease I had heard from her all night. "She has a spine," she said, her tone light, but her eyes thoughtful as they rested on me. And Adrian exhaled quietly, the faintest hint of something like amusement, touching his features before it disappeared again beneath that controlled exterior. The check never came, not in the way I was used to. There was no waiting, no calculation, just a subtle nod exchanged between Adrian and a staff member I had not even noticed approaching, and it was handled without a word, as if the concept of closing the meal existed on a different level entirely for him. I shifted slightly in my seat, the reality of my shift creeping back in at the edges of my awareness, the part of me that still belonged to this place reminding me that I was supposed to be working, supposed to be moving, serving, staying within the lines I understood, and I started to rise instinctively. I should get back, I said, my voice softer now, not out of uncertainty, but because it felt like stepping away from something unfinished. Margaret's hand touched mine once more, light but deliberate, stopping me just for a second, and when I looked at her, she gave the smallest nod, as if acknowledging both the moment and the choice to leave it. Kindness is not a small thing, she said quietly, and the words settled into me in a way I knew would not fade with the end of the night. I stood then, smoothing my uniform out of habit, my movements returning to something familiar even though everything else felt different, and when I looked back at Adrian, his gaze was already on me, steady, unreadable but not distant, like he was marking something, remembering something. Emily, he said, my name carrying a weight that made it feel less like a simple address and more like something intentional, and I paused, meeting his eyes one last time. Yes? I asked, and there was a brief silence, not empty, but deliberate, before he spoke again, his voice low, controlled, final in a way that lingered even after the words were gone. I do not forget people who choose right when it costs them. And the meaning settled deeper than the sentence itself, not a promise, not a warning, but something in between, something that would follow me long after I walked away from that table. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to say anything that would not sound smaller than what the moment deserved. And as I turned to step back into the rhythm of the restaurant, the familiar noise closing in around me again, I realized that nothing about this place had changed, and yet somehow, everything had, because for the first time since I started working here, I had not just been part of the background, I had been seen, and that was something no shift, no uniform, no expectation could take back.